The observation window was 4.7 centimeters thick and polarized to filter out the radiation that leaked from the station's aging reactor core. Veth pressed the tips of two of her fingers against it anyway, feeling for warmth that wasn't there. Below the window, through the reinforced glass, Bay 7 of the Harrock Medical Station stretched out in clean institutional white. Cots, monitoring strands, IV architecture, soft blue indicator lights ticking rhythmically over occupied beds. 16 beds, 11 of them human. She had been watching for 11 standard hours. Her data tether hummed against her wrist. The notation file for Project Spatial B was still open, still waiting, cursor blinking in the Doakai manner. A slow, patient pulse, like the heartbeat of something that had learned to wait a very long time. She had not typed a single word. The notation file had been open for 11 hours and 43 minutes. In that time, she had written 6 words, subject presence elevated vital indicators during, and then deleted them because they were inaccurate. The subject's vital indicators were not elevated. They were within normal parameters for a recovering human, which the Bureau's database described as chronically suboptimal by collaborative baseline standards. A characterization that had, at the start of this posting, seemed purely descriptive, and which had lately begun to strike her as something else. She wasn't sure what else yet. This bothered her more than the empty notation file. Veth withdrew her fingers from the glass. She was not technically supposed to be here. The upper observation gallery was a structural relic, built during the station's original Vethkai construction phase, before the collaborative treaty had handed it over to mixed species management. The gallery had no official purpose now, no designation in the current station manifest, and no climate controls. It was cold. Her secondary breathing sac was laboring slightly in the thin, recycled air, and her visual cortex was compensating for the flicker at the edge of the polarized glass in a way that gave her a faint, persistent ache behind her left orbital cluster. She didn't move. Down in Bay 7, the human was awake again. His name was Davi Santos. She had memorized this from his intake file, along with his age, 31 standard years, though the conversion to Doakai cycles put him somewhere in the equivalent of adolescence by their developmental mapping. His species designation, Homo sapiens, Class 3 biological, Category B provisional, that last notation added by her predecessor on the project, Dr. Orvin, who had submitted his own preliminary report 6 months ago and been rotated off station before completing it. And his injury classification, severe crush trauma to the lower thoracic region, 3 fractured load-bearing structures in his spine, punctured secondary lung, lacerations requiring approximately 43 closures of varying depth. He had been brought in 8 days ago on a loading skiff, unconscious, bleeding from 3 separate sites, smelling of machine lubricant, and something sweet that the station's atmospheric sensors had flagged as unidentified biological compound, before one of the human nurses explained it was coffee, a stimulant beverage the loading crews drank from battered metal containers that they refilled from a shared tank in the cargo bay, and which apparently Davi Santos had been drinking at the moment of the accident, judging by the burn mark on his left palm. The accident itself had been straightforward. A cargo container rated at 11 metric tons had shifted during docking, when the magnetic locks failed at a 0.003% probability moment that the station's engineering team was still investigating. Davi Santos had been directly beneath the container on a maintenance ladder. 3 of his crewmates had pulled him free before the container could complete its descent. 2 of those crewmates had minor injuries from the rescue. None of them had been assigned to rescue him. It had not been in their duty parameters. This was the first thing that had made Veth stop her data tether and simply look. She had been assigned to Project Spatial B for 14 months. It was her 3rd posting with the Doakai Classification Bureau, and it was supposed to be her last major assignment before she was elevated to senior assessor. a promotion that would carry her off the outer stations and back to the Dawkai home cluster, where the work was administrative, and the air was warm, and there were no cold observation galleries with flickering polarized glass. Project Spatial B was a classification survey. That was the bureaucratic language. In practice, it meant she was here to collect sufficient observational data on humanity to submit a final recommendation on whether the provisional Category B designation should be made permanent. Category B was not, officially, a derogatory classification. The Bureau's literature was careful about this. Category B simply meant species assessed as biologically functional but culturally and cognitively insufficient for full collaborative expansion rights. Category B species could trade, could occupy shared stations under collaborative administration, could apply for limited research partnerships and medical access. What they could not do was petition for territorial sovereignty, apply for collaborative fleet affiliation, vote on expansion treaties, or be considered for senior administrative roles in shared installations. In other words, they could exist in the collaborative space. They could not shape it. The language of Category B was careful never to use the word inferior. The Bureau's stylistic guidelines prohibited it, had prohibited it for over a century, since a particularly contentious reclassification hearing in which a Vethkai delegate had pointed out, with the particular brand of Vethkai patients that managed to be simultaneously polite and devastating, that inferior was not a scientific designation but a moral one, and that the Bureau was supposed to be conducting science. The guidelines had been amended within the decade. The word inferior was gone. What remained were 17 other words that added up to the same conclusion, and a bureaucratic architecture that enforced the conclusion without needing to state it, which the Vethkai delegate would probably have found equally worth commenting on. But by then, she had retired. 12 other species currently held Category B status. Several had held it for centuries. The Vethkai, who had built this station, had been Category B for 217 years before a single defining act of collective sacrifice during the Omrak conflict had elevated them to full collaborative partnership. The Dawkai tended not to advertise that part of the history. It complicated the message. The expected outcome of Project Spatial B was permanent Category B for humanity. Dr. Orvan's preliminary notes, which Veth had inherited along with the data tether and the gallery key, were already trending toward that conclusion. Humans were physically fragile, emotionally volatile, technologically nascent, socially fractious. Their recorded history was a catalog of self-inflicted catastrophes. Their capacity for cooperation decreased measurably under stress and increased primarily in response to shared enemies, which was not cooperation so much as tactical proximity. Their individual biological units had short lifespans and spent significant portions of those lifespans in states of vulnerability, illness, injury, sleep, that made them dependent on environmental support structures at levels the Dawkai found difficult to optimize for in shared facility planning. Dr. Orvan's notes had used the word inefficient 47 times. Veth had counted. She had also counted, though she had not noted this in any official file, the 23 times Dr. Orvan's notes used the word surprising, always in a subordinate clause, always followed by a however, or a nevertheless, always quickly contained and moved past. The subject demonstrated surprisingly effective adaptation under environmental constraint. However, long-term prognosis for category, a reclassification remains poor given biological vulnerability windows. The crew's response to the docking incident was surprising in its speed and coordination. Nevertheless, this appears to be an anomalous case rather than a systematic capability. 23 surprises, all dismissed. 47 inefficiencies, all retained. She had been trained in the Bureau's methodology. She recognized the mechanics of confirmation. She also recognized, with the particular discomfort of a scientist confronting her own bias, that she had arrived at this posting predisposed to confirm the preliminary finding. She had read Dr. Orvan's notes before she had observed a single human. She had known what category B meant. She had been, in the most technical and honest sense of the word, looking for evidence of a conclusion she had already been given. This was, according to the Bureau's own assessment guidelines, Section 14, Paragraph 3, a methodological failure. She had never submitted a report with a methodological failure. She wasn't sure she was going to now, but she was starting to understand that she might need to report that the methodology itself had won. Down in Bay 7, Davy Santos was trying to sit up. The monitoring strands over his bed registered the shift in his vital readings and pulsed amber, not a crisis signal, just a notation, a gentle mechanical reminder that his thoracic repairs were still at 40% integration, and that sitting up was not yet advisable. He appeared to be ignoring this. He had gotten his elbows under himself and was pressing upward with the slow, grinding determination of something that had forgotten it was supposed to be broken. Veth watched. From across the bay, a human nurse, the one with the short dark hair and the small tattoo on her left wrist, whose name tag Veth had read as Claudia in the human Portuguese script and had cross-referenced to Claudia Ferreira, medical technician level 2, 7 years on the station, looked up from the data terminal she'd been updating. She crossed the bay in 4 strides. She didn't run, but she moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this before. She reached Davy's bed, said something Veth couldn't hear through the polarized glass, and placed both hands on his shoulders, not pushing him back down exactly, more like steadying him, meeting his upward motion with something that acknowledged it while also containing it. Davy said something. Claudia said something back. There was a pause. Then Davy's elbows bent, and he lowered himself back against the pillows, and Claudia adjusted something at the back of the bed, raised the incline slightly, maybe 15 degrees, so he was propped up rather than fully flat. Not what he'd been going for. Not nothing either. Claudia went back to her terminal. Davy stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and said something to the man in the next cot, who was recovering from a lung infection contracted in the outer pressurized tunnels. That man, Miguel, Veth had cross-referenced, made a sound that her sensors registered as laughter. Veth opened her notation file. She wrote, "Subject demonstrates persistent drive toward physical autonomy, even at cost of recovery timeline. Care provider intervention redirected rather than suppress subject's initiative. Relationship between caregiver and patient appears to incorporate elements of negotiation. Note for comparison. Dawkai recovery protocols mandate patient immobility for full integration periods. Human protocols appear to incorporate a tolerance for controlled noncompliance." She read it back. She deleted asterisk noncompliance. She replaced it with asterisk agency. She stared at the word for a moment. Then she closed the file. The thing about Project Spatial B, the thing that Dr. Orvan had never quite grappled with in his 47 uses of inefficient, was that the data was supposed to be simple. You observed, you measured, you applied the Bureau's 18 established assessment metrics, which covered biological resilience, cognitive processing speed, social coordination capacity, technological development stage, resource management efficiency, and conflict resolution methodology. You assigned scores. The scores averaged out. If the average landed below the Category A threshold, you wrote your conclusion, submitted your report, and went home. Veth had been trying to do this for 14 months. The problem, and she was only now in the cold of the gallery, allowing herself to name it as a problem rather than a data anomaly, was that the 18 metrics kept producing scores that didn't cohere. Humanity was simultaneously scoring in the bottom quartile on biological resilience, short lifespan, high injury rate, extensive vulnerability windows, and the top quartile on something the metric called adaptive behavioral response under threat, which was Bureau language for when things go wrong, How fast does the species find a new approach? And they kept scoring anomalously high on a metric that wasn't one of the official 18. It wasn't in the Bureau's assessment framework because it had never been identified as a significant variable in prior assessments. It didn't have an official name. In her private notation file, the one she kept separate from the project's spatial B data tether, the one she would never formally submit, Veth had been calling it the clustering behavior. It was this: when a human was injured or ill, other humans came. This was not a novel observation. Social species cared for their sick. The Bureau's Metric 12 covered cooperative social behavior, but Metric 12 was measuring coordination under organizational directive. How well did members of the species follow care instructions issued by a governing authority? That was a measure of obedience, of system compliance. It was a reasonable thing to measure. What was happening in Bay 7 was not Metric 12. The humans who came to Davy Santos's bed had not been assigned to him. Claudia Ferreira was his listed primary care technician, and her visits were Metric 12. They were in the system, scheduled, documented. But there were others. The cargo supervisor, a broad-shouldered woman named Renata, who was not medically trained and had no professional reason to be in Bay 7 at all, who came every other day on her off shift and sat beside Davy's bed for 40 minutes and talked to him about something that made him close his eyes and smile. The two crewmates who had helped pull him from under the container, who had submitted their incident reports and been cleared for duty, and who nevertheless appeared in Bay 7 on 6 separate occasions bringing food from the station's human canteen. Not the medical nutrition the Bay provided, but things from the actual kitchen, actual meals in covered containers that smelled, faintly and improbably, of something Veth's atmospheric sensors classified as common and roasted fat. An older engineer Veth didn't have on file who came once and stayed for 2 hours and mostly just sat there, reading something on a handheld screen, not talking, as if his physical presence was itself the point. And the night technician, a very young man whose name tag said Felipe. He was not assigned to Bay 7 at all. He worked in the pediatric ward 2 levels up, who came by at the end of his overnight shift, stood at the foot of Davy's bed for 2 minutes in the quiet blue of the night cycle lighting, adjusted the blanket that had shifted, and left. Nobody had told him to do that. On the 9th day, Veth went down. She had reasons. She was an assessor. She was permitted to enter any patient-facing area for observational purposes. She had not, in 14 months, made significant use of this permission. She had preferred the gallery. The gallery was clean. The gallery had no smell, no sound, no human nearness, no risk of interaction that might compromise observational neutrality. She told herself she was going down because she needed to conduct a standard patient interview for the spatial behavior component of Metric 7. Metric 7 was the closest the Bureau's framework came to asking about how individuals related to physical space, territory, proximity, comfort distances. It was the metric that had produced the most unusual results with human subjects, because human comfort distances were erratic and contextually dependent in ways that dog-eye spacing intuitions did not easily map onto. She put on her assessment lanyard, she took her data tether, she went down. Bay 7 smelled of antiseptic and the faint vegetal sweetness of human respiration, and something else she couldn't categorize, not quite the coffee from the incident report, something warmer, fainter. The lights were in their mid-cycle setting, bright but not harsh. 6 of the 11 human patients were asleep. 3 were on personal communication devices. 1 was in a slow, carefully supervised walk up the center aisle with a physiotherapy technician pacing beside him. And Davy Santos was awake, propped at his 15-degree incline, with a battered paperback novel open face down on his stomach, and his eyes fixed on the ceiling in a way that was clearly not reading and clearly not sleep, but something in between, the look of a person whose body is at rest and whose mind is somewhere else entirely. He registered her arrival before she was halfway to his bed. Most human patients looked at her with the slightly uncomfortable attention humans tended to give to Dawkai. The compound eye arrangement and the secondary breathing apparatus tended to produce what Veth had come to recognize as the species-specific recalibration stare, the moment where a human was visibly updating their baseline expectations for what a face was supposed to look like. Davi Santos did this briefly, took about 3 seconds, and then relaxed in a way she couldn't quite account for. "Hey," he said, the Portuguese word for a casual greeting, cross-referenced in her language module. "Hello," she said. Her spoken Portuguese was adequate. "My name is Veth. I am an assessor with the Dawkai Classification Bureau, currently attached to this station. I would like to ask you some questions if you are willing. Participation is voluntary." "Sure," he said. He shifted against the pillows, winced, and stopped shifting. "I've got nothing going on." He gestured at the ceiling with one hand in a way that seemed to encompass the entire situation: the bed, the bay, the station, perhaps the broader fact of being immobile in deep space with 3 cracked vertebrae. She sat in the chair beside his bed. It was the same chair Renata had used. She noticed, without meaning to, that it was positioned at an angle that made it easy to see both his face and the room facing inward, oriented toward company rather than away from it. "You were injured 8 days ago," she said. "9, he said. She checked her tether. 8 standard days since intake. 9 since it happened. He said it without correction in his voice, without the edge of someone who wanted to win, just a clarification. Before I got here, time was still passing. She noted this. She did not open the metric 7 template. She said, "Your crewmates have visited frequently." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not suspicion, not exactly, more like awareness. "Yeah," he said. "I have been observing the bay," she said, "for assessment purposes. The frequency of your non-assigned visitors is statistically notable compared to other patients in this facility." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the bay's far window, the station's outer ring was visible as a slow-moving curve of metal and light. "What does that mean?" he asked. "Statistically notable." "It means it is unusual," she said, "by the data I have available." He seemed to think about this. "Renata and Tiago pulled me out from under the container," he said. "That's why they come. They want to see, I don't know, that it mattered, what they did." The incident report notes that their rescue was outside their assigned duties. "Yeah," he looked at the ceiling again. "Nobody tells you to do that stuff. You see someone in trouble." He paused. "What would happen if I asked you that question, if you saw someone in trouble?" The question was direct enough that she felt it as a specific physical sensation, a slight increase in temperature regulation demand behind her primary eye cluster, which was what the Dawkai equivalent of being caught off guard felt like. She said, "I would assess the situation and follow appropriate protocol." "Right," he said, not dismissively, more like he was filing it. "Why does everyone keep visiting?" she asked. It was not metric 7, it was not any metric, she asked it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very dark and very steady, and she had the strange impression that he was extending to her the same courtesy he extended to the chair angle and the 15-degree incline, meeting her where she was, not where she was supposed to be. "Because they're my people," he said, "and I got hurt, that's it." She considered this. "The crewmates who visit, Renata, Tiago, the others, they are not your biological family." "No. And they have no organizational obligation to be here." "No. Then why do they come? What is the mechanism?" He looked at her the way people looked at questions that had never occurred to them to ask, not dismissively, more like someone being asked to describe the color of air. "There's no mechanism," he said. It doesn't work like that." He was quiet for a moment, finding words for something he'd never needed to put in words. "Tiago was there when it happened. He got his hands under the container and he pulled me free, and he got a cut on his arm that needed 12 stitches, and he spent the whole time they were stitching him up asking the nurse if I was okay. That's who Tiago is. And now he comes to see that I'm okay because the alternative is that he pulled me free and then stopped caring, and that's not something he's capable of. He paused. Does that make sense? It is internally consistent, she said carefully. He almost smiled. That's a very diplomatic answer. I am trying to understand, she said, and realized as she said it that this was the most honest thing she had said in 14 months on this station. He looked at her, really looked, in the way she had noticed humans did when they were deciding something. You know what I think, he said. I think you're measuring us and getting confused because whatever you're measuring keeps coming out wrong. She was quiet for a moment. What makes you think that? Because you're up in that gallery looking down at us like you're trying to figure out what kind of animal we are, he said, without hostility. And then you came down here and now you're asking me questions that aren't really about where I like to sit. He shifted against the pillows, carefully. I don't know what you're trying to decide about us. But I think maybe it matters. It may, she said. He nodded, seemed to decide something. Well, he said, come back tomorrow if you want. Renata's coming and she's funnier than me. She wrote in her private file, subject defines the behavior as self-evident, does not experience it as remarkable. Subject also appears to have identified the structural problem with this assessment more quickly than the assessor did. She came back the next day. She told herself it was a follow-up interview for Metric 7. She had not, in fact, gathered any Metric 7 data in the first interview. Renata was there when she arrived. Renata, the cargo supervisor, the broad-shouldered woman, sitting in the angled chair with her work gloves folded on her knee, and a cup of coffee balanced on the bedrill in a way that was probably not officially sanctioned. She looked at Veth with the species-specific recalibration stare, held it 3 seconds, then nodded in a way that apparently communicated an entire social transaction Veth's language module wasn't fully equipped to parse. Davy introduced them. Renata said something in rapid Portuguese that Veth's module rendered as the alien doctor, and Davy said something back that the module rendered as assessor, not doctor. It's different. And Renata said something that didn't fully translate and laughed. They made space for her. This was the thing she kept noticing, humans made space. The chair shifted. Renata moved her coffee. Davy adjusted his position in the small ways his injury allowed. There was a choreography to it that happened without discussion, a set of micro-negotiations conducted entirely through posture and eyeline, and the willingness to be slightly uncomfortable so someone else could be slightly less so. She sat. She listened. She wasn't interviewing. She was just present. It was not an assessment technique she had been trained in. She became acutely aware of how strange this felt, the simple act of being in a room with people without a data tether running, without a metric category to assign to each thing she observed. She kept reaching for the notation reflex and finding nothing to attach it to, which should have made her uncomfortable and instead produced something she couldn't categorize, something in the vicinity of relief. Renata told a story about the first month she'd worked cargo on the station, when she had miscalculated a load balance and sent 3 crates of organic nutrient paste into the outer ring at twice their rated velocity, and the crates had hit a pressure barrier, and the paste had, as she described it, gone absolutely everywhere, on everything forever. Davy laughed, and laughing clearly hurt him. He pressed a hand to his ribs and kept laughing anyway. Veth noted, human subjects willingly accept physical discomfort in exchange for the social experience of shared laughter. Then she closed the notation file and laughed too. It came out strange. Dorkai laughter was a different physical process, a specific vibration of the secondary breathing sac that produced a sound somewhat like a deep mechanical hum. Both humans looked at her. She felt the temperature regulation demand behind her eyes. Then Davy's smile widened and he said, "Okay, That's a great laugh, I love that. And Renata pressed her lips together and made a sound into her coffee. She came a third time and a fourth. She stopped counting the visits after the fifth. On one of those middle days, day 8 or 9, the days were beginning to blur at their edges in a way she attributed to sleep disruption and attributed more honestly, on reflection, to the fact that she had stopped watching the clock. She arrived in Bay 7 to find Tiago there, the crewmate with the 12-stitch arm, sitting with 2 other men she hadn't encountered before. They were cargo workers by their worn uniforms and the specific calloused quality of their hands. They had brought a card, a physical paper card, folded and obviously handmade, covered in writing in several different hands, which Davy was reading with the expression of someone being shown a thing that was costing them effort to keep their face composed about. She hung back near the bay entrance and watched. The card went around the group. Davy read it, passed it to Tiago, who made a sound and passed it back. There was a long moment where no one said anything. Then one of the men Veth didn't recognize, young, with a shaved head and a scar over his left eyebrow, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said something in Portuguese that her module translated loosely as, "We keep telling them it was the lock, but they're still reviewing the loading protocols, so watch your back when you're cleared." This broke the silence. There was a brief explosion of overlapping voices. Tiago, the young man, the third cargo worker, all talking at once in the rapid, compressed way human conversation sometimes went when people were comfortable enough together to stop taking turns. Davy was talking too, the most animated she had seen him, gesturing with one hand while the other rested carefully on his ribs. The monitoring strand over his bed was showing elevated vital indicators, heartbeat up, respiration rate higher, blood pressure marginally increased. He was, by the Bureau's biological metrics, worse. By every observable quality of his face and body and voice, he was better. She noted this discrepancy in her private file. Then she watched the rest of the visit. What she observed: laughter, argument, a brief and apparently good-natured dispute about something involving the loading bay's scheduling software that she couldn't fully follow, more laughter. One of the men produced something from his jacket, a small metal flask, which he passed to Davy, who accepted it, took a careful sip, and passed it back. Veth's sensors registered the contents as ethanol-based. Medical protocol almost certainly prohibited it. No nurse came to intervene. When the visitors left, Davy was elevated on both pillows, animated in a way the bed rest had not produced, still talking over the sound of their departing footsteps. The young nurse who came to take his midday readings, not Claudia, a different one she hadn't cataloged yet, checked the monitoring strand data, glanced at Davy's face, and said something that made him laugh. She marked something on her datapad that Veth later cross-referenced as patient mood status, significantly improved. The Bureau did not have a metric for patient mood status. She was beginning to think perhaps it should. On the 11th day, she brought him food. This was not in any protocol. She had passed the human canteen on her way through the habitat ring, and the smell had stopped her, the cumin and roasted fat that her sensors had been cataloging for days from the containers Tiago and the others brought. She had gone inside. She had looked at what was available. She had made selections based on what she had observed him receiving from visitors, cross-referencing with his intake dietary file. She had carried it to Bay 7 in a covered container borrowed from the canteen staff, who had given her the same recalibration stare, and then helped her find a container with a tight-fitting lid. He looked at the container. He looked at her. Something in his face did something she didn't have a notation category for. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He opened the container. He ate. She sat in the angled chair and watched the slow curve of the outer ring through the far window and did not think about her report. After a while he said, "How long have you been up in that gallery?" She went very still. "I saw you once," he said. "Reflection in the polarized glass. You've got a pretty distinct silhouette." He didn't say it accusatorially. He said it the way he said most things, as information offered. 14 months, she said. That's a long time to watch from a window. She didn't answer. What are you writing about us? He asked. She thought about Dr. Orvin and his 47 uses of inefficient. She thought about the Bureau's 18 metrics and their clean columns of scored data. She thought about Category B and what it meant, and what it had meant for the Vethkai for 217 years. She thought about the word she had replaced asterisk noncompliance with. I am still deciding, she said. On the 13th day, Davy Santos stood up on his own. It happened during the morning care round, which meant Claudia was in the bay along with 2 other technicians, and the station's lead physician, a tall Vethkai woman named Dr. Harron, who had the distinguished bearing of someone who had been practicing medicine in space for 40 years, and had seen everything except, apparently, this. Davy waited until the monitoring strand over his bed ticked through its morning calibration, and showed a thoracic integration reading of 62%, not the 75 the protocol required for unsupported standing, but higher than it had been yesterday, and apparently high enough for him. He moved the monitoring strand out of the way. He swung his legs to the side of the bed. He sat fully upright, which was a thing he had not done in 13 days, and the color drained from his face and came back, and he breathed through it. Claudia saw him from across the bay and started moving. Dr. Harron, who was reviewing a chart at the far station, looked up. He got his feet on the floor. Claudia reached him at the moment he was pushing himself upright, and her hands went to his shoulders, and there was the same negotiation as before, her steadying, him pushing, neither of them winning, neither of them losing. A collaborative act conducted between a woman who knew what the monitors said and a man who knew what his own body said, and both of them apparently deciding to meet somewhere in the middle. He made it vertical. He swayed, gripped the bedrail, stopped swaying. Dr. Harron stood a few feet back with her arms folded and her expression unreadable, which Veth had come to understand was the Vethkai expression for I disagree with what is happening, but I am choosing to observe before I intervene. Davy stood for 37 seconds. Then Claudia and Miguel from the next cot, who was now mobile, helped him sit back down, and his hands were shaking, and he was grinning like he had won something. He had not won anything, technically. He had stood for 37 seconds before a recommended integration threshold. The monitors would make a notation. Dr. Harron would have a word with him. He had stood. Veth opened her private notation file. She wrote, "The Bureau's framework categorizes human biological vulnerability as a primary indicator of Category B status. Short lifespan, high injury rate, extensive recovery windows. These metrics score lowest in our assessment of functional resilience. We measure how resistant a biological unit is to damage. We do not have a metric for what a biological unit does after damage. We do not measure the drive to stand. We do not measure the people who come to watch when someone stands." She read it back. She deleted nothing. There was a Dawkai engineer on the station, Chem, third-tier environmental systems, who had been stationed at Harrock for 2 years, and whom Veth knew professionally and liked in the distant, functional way she liked most colleagues. He was efficient, thorough, and disinclined to small talk, which she appreciated. They shared a meal in the Dawkai standard atmospheric section of the station's common area once a week, which was the kind of maintenance socializing her training had identified as healthy. She went to find him the evening of day 12. She needed to talk to someone who was not human. He was calibrating atmospheric filtration nodes in Junction 7, which he was allowed to do during his personal time because efficiency was, for Chem, a personality trait as much as a job function. He saw her coming and made a sound of greeting that didn't require words. "The assessment," she said without preamble. "How is it progressing?" he asked, not looking up from the filter housing. "It isn't," she said. "Or it is. I am not certain anymore that those are different states. He looked up then. His compound eyes, the same arrangement as hers, did the Dao-Kai equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The preliminary finding was established before you arrived, he said. Dr. Orvan's notes were thorough. Dr. Orvan's notes were thorough, she agreed. They were also measuring the wrong things. A pause. Kem set down his calibration tool. That is a significant claim. I am aware. The Bureau's framework has been validated across 41 species assessments. Yes, 41 species that are not human. She was finding words for something she had been circling in her private notation file for days, and the words, now that she was speaking them aloud, felt more solid than they had on the page. We designed the framework for species that optimize the individual biological unit. Longer lifespans, higher resilience, lower vulnerability. We score these things because they are how Dao-Kai think about strength, how most collaborative species think about strength, and humans score badly on all of them. They do, Kem said. His voice was neutral, which for Kem was the equivalent of careful attention. But they are not trying to optimize the individual, she said. They never have been. They are optimizing. I keep coming back to this word and I know it is imprecise, but the framework doesn't have a better one, the relationship, the bond between individuals. The network of mutual obligation and care that they build with each other, that they maintain actively even under resource pressure, even under physical pain, even when there is no organizational requirement to do so. She thought of the flask, the handmade card, the adjustable blanket. We are measuring the wrong unit entirely, and because we are measuring the wrong unit, we are misclassifying a strength as a weakness. Kem was quiet for a long time. He picked up the calibration tool, looked at it, set it down again. You will not be popular at the Bureau, he said finally. Probably not, she agreed. The Orvan finding has institutional momentum. 14 months of preliminary data trending the same direction. I know. Your recommendation, if it contradicts that, will require extraordinary substantiation. I have 14 months of observation, she said, and I have this. She held up her data tether. I have been keeping 2 files, one for the Bureau, one for myself. I need to decide whether to show the Bureau the second one. Kem looked at the data tether for a moment, then he looked at her. What is in the second file? He asked. She thought about it. The truth, she said. He was quiet again. Then he picked up the calibration tool and turned back to the filter housing. We were Category B for 217 years, he said, very quietly. I sometimes wonder what we lost in those 217 years, what we forgot how to be. He worked in silence for a moment. Show them the second file, Veth. She requested a consultation with Dr. Heron. They met in the physician's office, which smelled of Vethkai candle moss, and had a small photograph on the desk that Veth recognized as the Harrock Station's original construction crew, all Vethkai, taken before the collaborative treaty transfer, when this had been purely their station. Dr. Heron had been on that crew. You could see her in the back row, 40 years younger, her medical sash not yet worn to its current degree of distinguished softness. You want to understand their recovery behaviors, Dr. Heron said. She had reviewed the consultation request and was not visibly surprised. You have been in the upper gallery. Yes, Veth said. I know, Dr. Heron said. I worked this station for 6 years before the treaty transfer. I know all the structural relics. A pause. Dr. Orvan also used the gallery. What did he conclude? Veth asked, though she had read his preliminary notes many times. What his data told him to conclude, Dr. Heron said. What the metrics told him to find. He was a thorough man. She looked at the construction photograph. I have been practicing medicine for 41 years, 9 of them on this station since the treaty transfer. I have treated Dao-Kai, Vethkai, humans, and 6 other species. I have a question for you, Assessor. Yes, Veth said. In your assessment framework, Dr. Heron said, What does it mean when a patient recovers faster than the biological model predicts? Veth considered this. It suggests the biological model may be incomplete. Yes, Dr. Heron said. That is what it suggests. She turned the construction photograph slightly, as if positioning it for someone who wasn't there. Human patients, in my experience, recover approximately 22% faster than our models predict when they have consistent social contact from individuals who are not their assigned care providers. The effect is measurable. It is repeatable. I have written about it in 3 publications that the Collaborative Medical Board has classified as preliminary findings requiring further study. Her voice carried a particular quality on the last 4 words that Veth's emotional modeling flagged as dry irony. They have been requiring further study for 11 years. The Bureau's metrics do not account for this factor, Veth said. No, Dr. Heron said, they do not, because the Bureau's metrics were designed by species that do not have this factor. She looked at Veth directly. We Vethkai had it once, a very long time ago, before we became efficient. She let the word sit in the air between them. Your predecessor used that word a great deal. Veth said nothing. You have been visiting Base 7, Dr. Heron said. It was not a question. Yes. And what have you found there? Veth thought about the angled chair, the covered container of food, the 37 seconds, the blanket that Felipe had adjusted without being told. I have found data that does not fit the framework, she said. Dr. Heron nodded as if this was the correct answer to a question she had been asking for 11 years. Then perhaps, she said, the question is not whether the data fits the framework. Perhaps the question is whether the framework is the right one. Veth sat with this for a long moment. The office was quiet around them, only the low atmospheric hum of the station's life systems, the same sound in every corridor of Herok, the sound you stopped hearing after a few weeks and only noticed in its absence. When the Vethkai were reclassified, she said, after the Omrak conflict, what was the act? The Bureau describes it as a defining collective sacrifice. What did it mean in practice? Dr. Heron looked at the construction photograph for a long time. A collaborative fleet was engaged in the Omrak system, she said. Heavily outnumbered, the Vethkai sent every available ship, not their military ships, those were their authorized Category B allotment, 8 patrol vessels, barely enough to matter. They sent everything. Cargo haulers, medical transports, research vessels, station supply ships. They pulled crew from installations that needed them and they went. 1,200 ships of no military consequence, operated by people with no combat training, and they flew directly into a fleet engagement that should have killed every one of them. She paused, and it turned the engagement, not because of their military capability, because the Omrak fleet hadn't accounted for the psychological effect of 1,200 unexpected ships appearing on the sensor grid. It changed the calculation. It changed the will. Was that efficient? Veth asked. Absolutely not, Dr. Heron said. By any calculation the Bureau would run, it was an enormous waste of resources and personnel. 41 Vethkai ships were destroyed. 163 crew members were killed. She looked at Veth directly, and it was the greatest thing my species ever did. Not because of the outcome, though the outcome mattered, because of the decision, because every person who flew that day knew what they were flying into and flew anyway, not because they were ordered to, because they could not imagine doing otherwise. The room was very quiet. The Bureau reclassified you afterward, Veth said. Yes, Dr. Heron said. And do you know what the reclassification report cited? Military contribution to collaborative defense, demonstrated capacity for coordinated collective action, strategic value of expanded Vethkai fleet presence in contested systems. She smiled, and it was the tired smile of someone who had spent 40 years making peace with something that still, occasionally, did not sit right. Not one word about what it actually was. Not one word about the two Vethkai station engineers who cut their own life support to redirect power to weapons systems on a cargo hauler that had no business being in a battle, because the weapons operator was injured and they were the only two people left who could reach the console. The Bureau didn't have a metric for that, so it went unrecorded. She looked at the construction photograph again. I have thought about those two engineers every day of my career. Their names were Orcs and Vess. They are not in any official collaborative record. Veth looked down at her data tether. I am going to tell you something that will not surprise you, Dr. Heron said. The Vethkai have been losing that capacity, the one those two engineers had. Slowly, over the 200 years since reclassification, we have been integrating into the collaborative framework, adopting collaborative institutional values, optimizing our individual biological units, learning to be efficient. My generation is the last one that remembers the old stories. My grandchildren think the Omrak conflict is history. They think the 1200 ships were a tactic. She shook her head. They were not a tactic. They were love. Very badly armored, very impractical, extraordinarily effective love. She looked at Veth. Don't let them forget what those two engineers knew, she said. Whatever else your report says, don't let that be lost again. She sat in the gallery one final time on the 14th night. The station was in its dark cycle. Bay 7 was lit in the soft blue of nighttime operation, night being a human construct that the station had adopted because human circadian rhythms required it, which was a kind of small accommodation that Veth now found it difficult to think of as inefficiency. The occupied beds glowed faintly under their monitoring strands. The night technicians moved with the specific quiet of people who had learned to exist in other people's sleep. Davy Santos was awake. He often was at this hour. His sleep patterns were disrupted, as they were for many patients in recovery, and the station's night cycle monitoring showed he typically lay awake for an hour or two in the small dark hours, thinking whatever he thought. She had noticed this pattern from the gallery over the past 2 weeks and had come to think of it less as a symptom and more as a habit. The night wakefulness of a man accustomed to shift work, to the rhythms of a body that had learned to be useful at odd hours and hadn't yet understood that it was supposed to be resting now. She had also noticed that he was rarely alone during these hours. Not always visited. Sometimes he did lie there by himself, the blue light steady over him, and she could see from the monitoring indicators that he was neither asleep nor distressed, just present in the particular way of someone comfortable with their own company. But more nights than not, someone appeared. A nurse making a genuine care round who stayed a few minutes longer than required. A patient from another bed who was also awake, drifting over for quiet company. Once, inexplicably, a small maintenance robot had paused at the foot of his bed for 4 minutes before continuing on its route, and Davy had watched it go with an expression she'd had to catalog as fond. She had noted this in the private file as, subject appears to be a nexus point for social interaction in the ward environment. Other individuals gravitate toward him without apparent instrumental purpose. Effect persists even in non-waking hours. Then she had stared at the word nexus for a long time, thinking about networks and the nodes that held them together, and about what the Bureau's metrics had to say about that, which was nothing. Felipe was there. The pediatric ward technician, the very young one who had no assignment in Bay 7 and no professional reason to be here. He was standing at the foot of Davy's bed in the blue light, the way he'd done before, but this time he was talking, just talking, quietly, in the Portuguese that Veth's sensors could detect as sound but not fully parse at this distance. Davy was listening. After a few minutes, Felipe sat down on the edge of the empty cot beside him, the one that had held Miguel before his discharge, and they talked for a long time in the blue station night, two humans in a medical bay in deep space, one injured and one not, and nothing was required of either of them to be there except that they wanted to be. After an hour, Felipe stood, adjusted the blanket and left. Davy lay in the blue light for a moment. Then he turned his head toward the window, toward the outer ring, and Veth had the strange, displaced conviction that he was not looking at the ring, but through it, at the star field, at the distance, at whatever humans saw when they looked out at the long dark of space. Whatever it was that made them keep going into it, fragile as they were, short-lived and easily injured and dependent on each other in ways that the Bureau's 18 metrics had spent 20 years failing to correctly categorize. She opened her notation file. Not the private one, the official one. Project Spatial B. The cursor blinked its slow dog-eye patience. She began to write. Final observation report, Project Spatial B, Harrock Medical Station. Assessor Veth, Classification Bureau, Outer Reach Division. The Dog-eye Classification Bureau's current framework for assessing candidate species identifies 18 metrics across biological, cognitive, social, and technological dimensions. This framework has been in continuous use for 340 years and has successfully classified 41 species. It is a rigorous instrument. It was designed to be objective. It was designed to eliminate the assessor's subjectivity from the process. I am submitting this report with a recommendation that runs contrary to my predecessor's preliminary findings, contrary to the expected outcome of this project, and contrary to what the 18 metrics, applied by the Bureau's standard methodology, would produce. I am recommending that humanities category B designation not be made permanent. I am recommending that the Bureau open a formal review of the assessment framework itself. My data is attached. I will not summarize it numerically here. I will instead describe what I observed over 14 months in the upper gallery of Harrock Medical Station's Bay 7. What I observed when I came down from the gallery and sat in a chair beside a human patient's bed and watched what was not in the metrics. Humanity's most statistically notable characteristic is not their technological development, which is nascent. It is not their biological resilience, which is low by collaborative standards. It is not their cognitive processing speed or their social coordination capacity or their conflict resolution methodology. It is this: when one of them is damaged, the others come. They come without assignment, without organizational directive, without the expectation of reciprocal benefit within any time frame the Bureau's efficiency models would consider rational. They come because the damaged one is theirs, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of belonging. They bring food. They sit in chairs. They adjust blankets. They stand in blue nightlight for an hour talking about nothing and everything. They pull people out from under containers they were not required to approach. They laugh with people even when laughing hurts. The Bureau's Metric 12 measures cooperative behavior under organizational directive. It is measuring compliance. What I observed in Bay 7 is not compliance. It is something that precedes organizational structure, something that, in fact, generates it. The human capacity for care is not a downstream product of their social systems. It is the upstream source of them. A human patient with consistent non-assigned social contact recovers 22% faster than biological modeling predicts. Dr. Heron's research, classified as preliminary findings for 11 years, bears this out with rigorous data I am including in an appendix to this report. Humanity does not merely survive its biological vulnerabilities. It metabolizes them into dependency structures that increase collective resilience in ways that cannot be measured by assessing the individual unit. We have been measuring the wrong unit. Our framework was designed for species whose strength lies in the individual, the dog-eye. The original Veth-kai before the collaborative centuries changed them. Species that optimize the biological unit, minimize vulnerability, extend the lifespan, reduce the recovery windows. When we measure humans against these parameters, they fail. Of course they fail. They are not optimizing the individual. They are optimizing something else. They are optimizing the relationship. I observed a young technician with no assignment in Bay 7, adjust a patient's blanket in the middle of the night cycle, and leave without saying a word. I observed 2 cargo workers with minor injuries return repeatedly to the bedside of the crewmate they had pulled to safety, not because of organizational requirement, but because they needed to see that it had mattered, that the act of reaching for another person in a moment of danger had consequences that persisted, that showed up in the form of a man who was still alive and still getting better. I observed a patient stand for 37 seconds at 62% thoracic integration and laugh about it. I have been trying to find the word for what I observed in that bay for 14 months. The Bureau's framework does not have one. The closest translation from Portuguese, the language spoken by the patient I observed most closely, is something like, "The people who are yours." The Bureau asks whether a species is resilient enough for Category A status. I am suggesting we have been asking a category of question that does not apply to humans. Asking whether an individual human is resilient is like asking whether a single link in a chain is strong. The answer will always be, not vary. That is not the relevant unit of measurement. Humans have spent their entire evolutionary and cultural history compensating for the fragility of the individual through the construction of elaborate, redundant, emotionally dense systems of mutual care. Everything they have built, their technology, their medicine, their governance, their art, is downstream of this fundamental drive. They are not strong alone. They are extraordinarily strong together in ways that resist individual assessment because the strength is relational. It exists in the space between them. I am an assessor. I am supposed to be objective. I am submitting this report with the acknowledgement that in 14 months of observation, I was changed by what I observed. This is also data. The Bureau may weigh it as it sees fit. I recommend Category A provisional review for humanity, pending a full reformulation of the assessment framework's core metrics to account for relational resilience variables. Submitted by Assessor Veth, Harrock Medical Station, Outer Reach Division. On the 15th day, Davi Santos walked to the window. Not the observation gallery window, the bay's own window, at the far end of the ward, which looked out at a different angle on the same star field. Dr. Heron was present, and Claudia, and Renata, who had shown up during her off shift again, and Felipe, who was technically on duty 2 levels up and was probably being covered by someone who knew why he wasn't there. Davi made it the length of the bay with a steadying hand from Claudia and no other support, moving carefully but steadily, his thoracic monitors ticking amber, and then settling to green as his spine adjusted to the weight it hadn't carried in 15 days. He stood at the window. Outside, the ring, the dark, the stars. The collaborative shipping lanes marked by distant running lights. The long cold of deep space doing what it always did, presenting itself without comment, without mercy, without regard for the specific biological units examining it from their pressurized bubble of warmth and light and recycled air. He looked out for a long moment. The star field beyond the window was the same star field it had always been: old light, vast and indifferent, measuring nothing, caring about nothing. The collaborative shipping lanes marked their slow paths across it in the patient way of systems that had been running for centuries and expected to run for centuries more. Out there, somewhere in the dark, a Bureau committee was waiting for Veth's report. Out there, somewhere, a machinery of classification turned and clicked and assigned species to their appropriate boxes and called it understanding. She looked at Davi Santos standing at the window of a space station he had no business being alive in. By every metric the Bureau had spent 300 years refining, and thought about the 2 Vethkai engineers whose names were Orcs and Ves, who had cut their own life support and were not in any official record. She thought, we keep building frameworks to understand what other beings are, and we keep forgetting that understanding is also a thing that happens between people. Not in the data, in the space between the one who is looking and the one being seen. Then he turned back to the room, to the people standing in it, and said something Veth couldn't hear from the doorway where she had paused, lanyard around her neck, data tether in her hand. She didn't need to hear it. She could see what it was in the faces of the people around him, the specific quality of human attention when something has been earned. Renata's grin, Claudia's exhale, Felipe pressing the heel of his hand against his eye for a moment in a way that her cultural briefings told her was a human response to an emotion that the person wanted to contain. She stood in the doorway and thought about 217 years. She thought about Dr. Heron's construction photograph. She thought about what it cost a species to be seen through the wrong lens for that long, categorized by a framework that was measuring the right thing in entirely the wrong place. She thought about a cursor blinking in patient Dawkai darkness, waiting for a conclusion she had finally found. On the far side of the bay, Davy Santos looked up and saw her. He lifted one hand, not the coffee-burned one, the other one in a small wave. She looked at him. A human, 31 years old, 3 cracked vertebrae healing at 62 and now 78% integration, who had been crushed under 11 metric tons of cargo and pulled free by people who had no organizational reason to reach for him, but had reached anyway, who had lain in this bay for 15 days collecting visitors like a gravitational field, drawing people toward him by no mechanism she had ever been trained to measure, who had looked at her in the second day and seen that she was measuring the wrong thing and said so plainly, not with cruelty, but with the particular directness of someone who was comfortable looking at the truth. She thought about the question he had asked her early on, what would happen if you saw someone in trouble? She had said, I would assess the situation and follow appropriate protocol. She had not answered the question. She raised her data tether. The gesture was absurd, a bureaucratic instrument raised in response to a human wave in a medical bay in deep space between an alien assessor and a cargo worker with a healing spine. It was not in any protocol. It was not in any metric. It was, she realized, exactly the right thing to do. He smiled. She went in. 3 months later, the Bureau's assessment committee in the Dawkai home cluster received a report unlike any they had processed in 340 years of operation. It was accompanied by 14 months of observation data and 3 appendices, one containing Dr. Heron's 11-year study on relational recovery acceleration, one containing Veth's private notation file in its entirety, clearly labeled as such, and one containing no data at all, only the names of 2 Vethkai engineers, Orcs and Ves, and a single sentence beneath them. Some things should be in the record. The committee debated for 6 weeks. They requested clarification. They consulted 3 external methodologists and convened 2 special hearings. They used the word unprecedented 14 times in their internal communications, which someone later counted, though they never said so officially. They opened the review. It was the beginning of something that would take years and would be contested, and would involve a great deal of committee language that was careful never to use certain words while meaning them anyway, and a reformulation of the assessment framework's core metrics that would not be completed in Veth's career. It would be the work of the next generation, and the one after that. But that morning, the morning the committee voted to open the review, Veth was not in the Dawkai home cluster. She was at Harrock Medical Station, in Bay 7, in the angled chair beside a bed that was empty now, its patient discharged and returned to the cargo bay where he belonged, where he was apparently already driving his supervisor Renata to distraction, by trying to help with load calculations while technically still on medical restriction. She sat in the chair for a while in the quiet of the bay, with its blue monitoring lights and its smell of antiseptic and human breath, and the faint ghost of cumin from a container someone had brought and left. She was not observing. She had nothing to assess. She was just there. After a while she took out her data tether and opened a new notation file, not a bureau file, not a Project Spatial B file, something new, something she didn't have a name for yet, and she wrote the only word that had come to her in the empty chair, the one she had been circling for 15 days and finally held still long enough to catch. Theirs. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the file and went to find Dr. Harron, and after that she went to find Kim, and after that she went to the human canteen where the coffee smelled like something warm in the cold dark of deep space. And she stayed.